us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
In the grand halls of American history, certain names echo louder than others. Among them, George Washington stands like a monolith, revered, memorialized, and mythologized as the first president of the United States. We are taught that he was a fearless general, a man of virtue, and a founding father born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, to a wealthy plantation family. But behind the neat stories in our textbooks and the clean portraits hanging in the Capitol lies a murky tale filled with distortions, omissions, and outright lies. What if the real origins of America's first president were far more complex, racially, politically, and geographically, than we've been led to believe? The narrative that surrounds George Washington's life has been carefully constructed over centuries. This sanitized version ensures that he fits neatly into the myth of a white Anglo-American aristocracy leading a revolution for liberty. But digging into old colonial records, overlooked letters, suppressed oral histories, and international archives tells a more intricate tale, one the ruling elite worked hard to bury. There is growing evidence and scholarly inquiry suggesting that either the identity of the first president wasn't truly George Washington, or that Washington's own origins were obscured to maintain racial and colonial hierarchies that defined the early American Republic. To begin understanding this deception, we must revisit the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States, ratified in 1781. Under this system, the Continental Congress operated without a president in a modern sense. However, the presiding officer of Congress held the title President of the United States in Congress assembled. This position existed years before Washington ever took his oath of office in 1789 under the new U.S. Constitution. The first man to hold that title was John Hanson of Maryland, elected in 1781. He was followed by several others who occupied the same role. So why are they almost entirely erased from our collective memory? Why does the clock of presidential history only begin with George Washington? John Hanson, for example, was acknowledged by many of his contemporaries as the first president of the United States. Even George Washington himself is reported to have referred to Hanson in these terms. Yet schoolchildren never hear Hanson's name. A part of this erasure may have to do with the desire to place Washington, military hero and slave-holding Virginian aristocrat, at the symbolic center of the American founding. But the other part may be even more disturbing. In the early 20th century, as part of the lost cause mythology and white supremacist historiography, scholars began suppressing any stories that contradicted the idea of a purely white, elite, and Protestant founding fathers. Even stranger is a thread of documents and historical accounts suggesting that John Hanson may have been a black man. In the 1800s and early 1900s, African-American intellectuals, including members of the Prince Hall Masonic Lodges and early Pan-Africanists, circulated the belief that John Hanson, the first president, was of Moorish or African descent. A photograph from the Library of Congress labeled John Hanson depicts a man of African descent dressed in formal 19th century attire. While mainstream historians have dismissed the identification of this image with the John Hanson of the Continental Congress, the fact that it was circulated as such speaks to the power of suppressed history and the alternative narratives Black Americans sought to reclaim. The mystery deepens when we look at how George Washington became the first official president under the current Constitution. His selection wasn't merely based on merit. It was a political maneuver to ensure Southern states, deeply reliant on slavery, would support the new federal structure. Washington's immense wealth, built off enslaved labor at Mount Vernon, made him the perfect symbol of the early republic, a man both relatable to the elite and palatable as a national icon. There were few better figures to sanitize and enshrine in marble. But there's another layer to this deception, the racial ambiguity that once surrounded Washington's ancestry. While this theory is controversial, several 19th century and early 20th century writers, including abolitionist activists and European researchers, speculated about the potential mixed heritage of key American founders. British and French sources from the colonial period sometimes described prominent Virginians as tawny, dark-skinned, or of Moorish aspect. These descriptors may not have always referred to Africans directly, but they challenge the standardized notion of whiteness projected onto figures like Washington. The idea of a pale, powdered wig-wearing George is as much a myth as the cherry tree tale. Some speculate that Washington's mother, Mary Ball Washington, may have had mixed ancestry, an open question largely ignored by mainstream historians. Certain genealogical records point toward the Ball family's connection with indentured servants and early colonists from North Africa and the Mediterranean, regions that frequently produced white-passing individuals in the British colonies. In early colonial America, racial classifications were less rigid and more fluid than they became after the 18th century. It wasn't until race became enshrined in law and economics, through slavery codes, voting restrictions, and land ownership exclusions, that strict racial hierarchies were enforced and rewritten backward into history. This rewriting allowed the ruling classes to present a homogeneous story of American leadership. Figures like Crispus Attucks, of African and Native descent, and the first man to die in the American Revolution were minimized. Black contributions to the Revolutionary War, despite thousands of enslaved men fighting for both the British and the colonists, were erased or relegated to footnotes. Reconstructing George Washington as the first president under the 1789 Constitution helped consolidate this whitewashed founding narrative. Further complicating this picture is the question of sovereignty. The indigenous nations that inhabited the American continent long before the colonies had their own political systems, leaders, and presidencies. The Iroquois Confederacy, for instance, had a sophisticated system of governance and diplomacy that inspired aspects of the U.S. Constitution. Many native leaders, such as the Onondaga chief Canasatigo, advised colonial thinkers about federalism, checks and balances, and the value of unity among distinct nations. So, in a broader historical sense, the idea of presidency in America did not begin with George Washington at all. It was an appropriation, a reframing of leadership that ignored and silenced centuries of indigenous governance and Afro-Indigenous sovereignty. There's also the question of historical timelines. For instance, was the United States truly a nation before 1789, or was it merely a confederation of loosely connected colonies seeking identity? If we accept the former, then men like John Hanson deserve recognition as early presidents. If we accept the latter, then Washington was the first president under a newly codified government, but not the first American leader. Either way, the simplification of these questions into a single name and date, George Washington, 1789, betrays the layered complexity of America's origins. What emerges from this deep excavation is not just a correction of who was first, but a dismantling of the carefully constructed mythos that props up the American national identity. The image of a singular, white, noble George Washington standing as the genesis of American democracy is both a political tool and a historical fiction. It erases the black and indigenous hands that built the country, fought in its wars, and governed long before the word president was ever written into law. History, as always, is written by the victors, but truth belongs to the people. And as new generations dig deeper, uncovering what was hidden in dusty archives and oral traditions, the real story of America begins to emerge, not as a tale of white saviors, but as a complex, multicultural, often contradictory struggle for power, recognition, and freedom. The truth may be inconvenient to those who benefit from the lie, but it is a truth that demands to be told.
Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.